Representative Derek Smith had his day in committee, and retired state workers may soon pay more for their health care. That's up next on Capitol View. Good evening, and thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois government and politics. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn from Illinois Issues Magazine, and with me today is Kent Redfield, Professor Emeritus of Political Science with the University of Illinois at Springfield. Professor, thanks for being here.
Good to be here.
And Professor Christopher Mooney, Professor of Political Science with the University of Illinois at Springfield as well. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
We're going to start off today. Representative Derek Smith, who has been accused of bribery. He was accused of taking a $7,000 bribe for writing a letter of recommendation for a daycare center for a grant. Now, the daycare center was not actually seeking that grant. He was the subject of a federal sting. He showed up for a committee hearing today. The House is looking into whether or not they want to take disciplinary action against Representative Smith. He gave a statement, he didn't go under oath, and he didn't answer questions. Professor, does this help him out at all? What is the strategy here for him actually appearing in front of the committee?
Well, he is, he's trying to balance off maintaining that he's still a representative and that he's functioning with what I'm sure is a legal strategy that is either going to be out of the Blagojevich playbook to kind of, ignore the things on the tape, I'm really innocent, or he may be trying to leverage his office in terms of some type of deal with the U.S. Attorney. And so it's not, if he were to resign his office, he would lose leverage and would look guilty. And so he's not going to do that, at least not at this point. So it's a little bit of a standoff, and it puts the legislature in an uncomfortable position, because clearly it reflects badly on the legislature to have him as part of the body, but they don't want to either get ahead of the prosecution, and it's a big deal to kick a member out, and so it makes for a pretty uncomfortable situation.
Well, there was a lot of dancing around the legal issue. His lawyer did answer questions, but his response was often, I can't really answer that question until we get the full view of what the prosecution has as far as evidence. This was kind of reminiscent of Blagojevich's defense before the Senate. Professor Mooney, I mean, there are some parallels here, and that seems like it would hurt him for legislators who were around for Blagojevich and still kind of have that bitter taste in their mouths.
Right. Well, I don't really think that he is trying to win anything in these committees. It's basically just sort of sandbagging, as Kent said, is to hold things off until he can work it out. This is the least of his worries, right? He really had to mostly worry about the federal prosecutor up in Chicago, Patrick Fitzgerald, who's got a number of many bigger skins on his wall than Derek Smith, and what the legislature does. They're tying themselves in knots, trying to figure out what to do. Because it is a new thing, and this is something that I think people in Illinois don't appreciate. Our legislature actually is quite untainted by corruption and convictions for corruption as compared to many other states in the last sort of 10, 15 years. Arizona, South Carolina, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, the vaunted, virginal state of Wisconsin. They had their Democratic leader of the Senate was serving on work release and coming, from the county jail down to the state house for a while to serve. So this is something relatively unfamiliar territory for the General Assembly, for the House, and it's tricky for everybody concerned, I think.
Well, and it looked as though Smith's lawyer was kind of trying to make the case down the road for entrapment. The feds did kind of set up this whole concept of the bribe, and then an informant came to him and offered the bribe, was kind of the go-between. Smith's lawyer went after that informant's credibility a little today, and also didn't go so far as to discuss entrapment, but he seemed to be hinting in that direction. Is that really his only hope at defense here?
Yeah, clearly, he's on tape, and the question is whether or not it was entrapment or not. And if you get to a jury pool, then any statements that you're making, he's getting publicity. This is going to be in the papers tomorrow on the 6 o'clock news, and you're trying to affect the jury pool. Blagojevich had exactly the same strategy. And the legislature, is the sole judge of the qualifications of their members. Now, if Smith is convicted, he would forfeit office. The Constitution says if you're convicted of a felony, you can't hold office, you can't run. But the legislature can expel him without a conviction. They clearly can do that. They are the sole judge of the qualifications of their members. It probably is going to get sorted out, but this could go on into the fall and running in a third-party candidate against Representative Smith in the general election. If it would come to that if he were still on the ballot, because clearly the Democratic Party doesn't want to have him reelected, and right now he has no opponent. The Republicans didn't run anybody, and so he would win by default if there isn't someone else on the ballot.
Yeah, he hasn't disappeared yet. I think some Democrats were hoping that maybe he could be pushed aside. That's still the hope. How much of a thorn is he going to be in the Democratic Party side as this continues, especially for those folks who said, hey, go ahead and vote for him? So hopefully we can hang on to this possibility as a Democratic seat.
Well, I think it's a more or less a minor annoyance. I don't think this is. I mean, there are so many big issues, important issues to everybody in the state that are happening in this session of the legislature. This is probably one of the most significant sessions of the legislature in living memory. And the fact that you've got this joker, trying to, well, who knows? I mean, he's alleged to have tried to get this bribe, and it's annoying. The political operatives are going to be tying themselves up, trying to figure out how to solve this problem. But it's a minor footnote on this session, I think.
Yeah. It's embarrassment for the local party officials and the Secretary of State who was involved with this, and it certainly can be one more item in a Republican narrative about the corrupt, incompetent Democrats, and look, they even have somebody that was indicted won a Democratic primary in Chicago. So it can add to that kind of anti-Chicago narrative for Republican candidates. But it is, I think Chris is right, it's a sideshow at this point.
And especially because you don't have any statewide candidates or any statewide races, and so everything is on a local level, and Republicans are not going to win in that district, and they're probably not going to take the majority no matter what. So what happens in some district in Chicago is not going to affect sort of any kind of close partisan battle, probably out in the suburbs somewhere, one of the few places, or in the Springfield area where there may be one or two.
Well, and as you said, Chris, there's a lot of big issues still swirling in session. One issue that it looks like may be decided today as I left the State House for taping, we are taping on Thursday, the Senate Executive Committee had taken up this, what some state workers probably think is an ominously named bill, Senate Bill 1313, that would take away a lot of their health care benefits. Basically, a lot of state workers now do not pay premiums on their health care. They do pay co-pays and other costs. And this bill would take that away. It would allow the state CMS to set the amount of money that the state's going to pay, and then the workers would have to pick up the rest through premiums. At first we were looking at this bill as maybe a bluff, maybe a way to negotiate pension changes. But Professor Redfield, if this happens, what does it mean for the pension negotiations, and what does it mean about how serious Democrats might be about taking away some of these perks for state workers?
Well, and just to be clear, we're talking about retirees. Yes. We're not talking about people who are currently employed by the state. Their health care is there's a deduction from their check that covers their health care costs. But this is a retiree. If you're if you're a retiree with more than 20 years, you do not pay health care either in terms of normal coverage if you're under the age of 65, or if once you become 65 and go on Medicare, then the state would be a supplemental, your state insurance, and the state is currently paying those premiums. So it's very real for people who have retired. there are a couple things going on. If the governor kind of indicated that he'd like to trade continuing this health care for retirees in exchange for concessions on pensions to kind of renegotiate the contract. So you can't have it as leverage in negotiations and also abolish it. That doesn't make any sense at all. And so we don't know whether we're going to run it out there and kind of hold it over people, or whether they're just going to bite the bullet and pass it. If they pass it, then the cost of this health care, the state paying the premiums, is probably $800 million. It would be probably done on a prorated basis depending on how big a person's pension is and how many years they had in. So you're not going to save the whole $800 million, but this is money out of the general revenue fund for this year's budget. If you save $400 million on retiree health care, then that's $400 million you don't have to cut out of Medicare. So this has real consequences for the current budget, and because it's a state law rather than part of anyone's pension agreement, it's perfectly constitutional for the legislature to do this. So we don't know whether it's about saving money so that we don't have to cut Medicare so much, or whether it's about having leverage for pension negotiations. It's not clear at this point which way that's going to go.
Well, and it might be an indicator about a disagreement that's going on with the pension negotiations. Governor Quinn and Senate President John Cullerton feel that something has to be traded, something has to be, given in exchange for reductions to benefits. That would be letting workers keep this benefit, whereas Speaker Madigan and Minority Leader Cross maybe don't feel that way as much. They've said they don't know if that's necessary. So this might clear that up for us if it did pass, if Quinn did decide to sign on to this.
Well, I mean, if it passes and the governor signs it, then that's that. But it's certainly off the table in terms of negotiations. So, there's clearly a difference between the Speaker of the House and the Senate President about what is constitutional in terms of trying to force changes in pensions for current employees. You can't go after pensions for people who have already retired, either their COLAs or how much they're getting per month. But so the ball game is about unfunded liability for current employees, and we really are not going to know probably until we get right down to the deadline which way this is going to go.
Well, a quick disclaimer on this issue: since we all are employed by the university, we would all be affected by this legislation either in the future or presently. But I think we're okay with being able to be impartial and discuss this topic, but we want to let everybody know that out there. So when this passed, a lot of people in the House were saying, hey, we've made this promise, even though it's not in the Constitution, we have made this promise to retirees. And Speaker Madigan said, we have a lot of difficult decisions to make this year. If we can't make this one, what decisions can we make? Professor Mooney, does this kind of illustrate how much Democrats are willing to make some of these tough choices that are things that people never in the past might have guessed that they would do?
Right. I mean, this is about the only thing they can do regarding pensions, or at least the thing that is the clearest way of saving some money. There is debate about to what extent they can mess around with future benefits for current employees. And there's a constitutional provision that says they can't do anything about that, but there's debate, and it's going to end up, whatever happens is going to end up being decided by the Supreme Court. I think it's possible that this health care payments could still be used as a negotiation, because even if they pass it, because it's up to then CMS to make determination how much a subsidy would be in future, so they can bring that to the table. But it seems to me it's going to be very difficult for them to do anything else, even if they have this retiree health payment over the head of the unions or individuals who may try to opt into some other system. But most people will sit down and do the math. They'll figure out what's best for them, and in that way, probably the state's going to save less money. So really, from a practical perspective, this is the thing that's going to get them the biggest bite that they can keep, no matter what the Supreme Court says, probably. I mean, that actually is still a question. I mean, there will be a suit about this, but I think Kent's right that and most people I think would agree that this is something that can be done. And the speaker's also correct when he says, you know, this is the minimum that we can do. If this doesn't happen, you know, Katie, bar the door.
Yeah, it's real money for this fiscal year, and that's different than changing COLAs for cost of living adjustments for current employees. That affects your unfunded liability in out years, and it may affect your pension payment that the state has to make in fiscal, you know, next fiscal year or fiscal year after that. Anything we do on pension reform involving current employees that gets into unfunded liability has no impact on this year's budget. We're going to make the payment that we're required to make. And so there is, you know, there's a dance about how do we cut things out of the current budget. There's also kind of policy-wise, we want to fix pensions, but in terms of the November election, we want to be able to say we voted for pension reform. Nobody's going to know whether it's constitutional, whether it was a good idea, bad idea before people vote in November. And so the Democrats want to get something out there, and which gets us, you know, the next thing, which is the Republicans, you know, can be outvoted on the budget up until the 1st of June. And then after the 1st of June, if we go into overtime, then you have to deal the Republicans in. So there's a game going on about passing a budget and what role leverage that Republicans have.
So you think the temptation might be to give up this healthcare chip as leverage and instead grab onto it as a way to save money this year, and maybe we don't get as much out of pension reform?
That's entirely possible. And the Republicans, you know, are going to play one way or another. We now have a roll call in the House. We have 74 people who have voted to take a health care benefit away from retirees, people who serve the state under, you know, we assume honorably under a set of, you know, their understanding of what the rules of the game were, and, you know, now they're having something taken away that they had every reason to believe was part of their total compensation package, salary plus benefits. And so those 74 votes may be kind of the working majority in the House to do other things with pensions.
I wondered what your thoughts were on that as someone who has, you know, watched the process as a staff member. It's been a while, but people are kind of trying to read the tea leaves in this vote as to where it might go with a pension vote. And you're saying, yes, this might be something to look to, or?
Oh, you know, it does give you an indication that there were people that were willing to be on the roll call or off the roll call. Same thing with the vote we had in the Senate about whether we should restrict the governor's power to close facilities. And now you've got a roll call. And roll calls can change, but, you know, once you're in for a penny, in for a pound, once you vote to do things to state workers or do things to retirees, then you're on record for doing that. And the only thing, as people say, the only thing worse than voting for a tax increase that passes is voting for a tax increase that doesn't pass. And so this is a similar sort of thing. If, you know, if you're going to put yourself on the line, then you'd like to get something out of it if you're going to take the heat for having voted against the interests of unions, public employee unions, retirees.
And I think it's significant that this was not a close, well, it was fair, it was a divided vote, but it wasn't a razor-thin vote like it often would be if on controversial issues. You know, they'll get just enough, because they don't, you know, sometimes the people that the leadership will try to keep off because they don't want to threaten their elections in the fall or in the next primary or whenever. And in this case, they were over by, 14 votes. And that shows that there is a will, I think, to do something here. And actually, I was kind of surprised that it was that high, because I mean, it's heartening to me as a person who sees the financial situation that the state is in, that there seems to be now a willingness to take a hard vote and there's going to be more of them coming. And if they can continue to get in the mindset that these are going to be tough, there's going to be screaming and shouting. Now it's the public employees union, the retired employees. It's going to be the daycare people are down there today screaming and shouting about their cuts. There's going to be the providers from Medicaid. There's going to be the recipients of Medicaid. All these people and more, virtually everybody in the state is going to have significant pain when all's said and done with this budget, and nobody's going to get a lot of benefit out of it. That's the terrible situation they're in. Usually, if there's going to be if there's going to be a tax increase, somebody's going to get something out of it, right? In this case, you're going to have cuts, and you're going to have more taxes, and that's all there is, and that's painful for everybody. And what's needed is a coalition of members from both parties that will be willing to make these difficult decisions, and it looks like this may be the beginnings of that.
Well, and Chris, I think you make a really good point. When we have these very structured roll call votes, they're always so close, and sometimes they don't even make the vote the first time around. They put it on postponed consideration and corral a few people over. So they've got some room to breathe maybe on a pension vote in the future. Also in pension news this week, we're going to have a lot of pension news in the coming weeks. Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel came down to Springfield this week to talk about some changes he'd like to see happen to the city of Chicago's pension systems. Some of them were similar to the things that Quinn has put out there. He wants to see increased contributions. He wants to see the retirement age raised. He'd also like to see a freeze on the COLAs for retirees for 10 years. Adding this into the mix, does it complicate the issue, or does it help to have sort of Rahm Emanuel's clout behind pensions overall as an issue? Well,
I think that it is significant that the mayor of Chicago came down to Springfield, and it's been a while since you've had a mayor of Chicago come down to Springfield, and so clearly this mayor tends to be engaged with the legislature, and that changes the dynamic. For a long time back in the 60s and 70s, the mayor of Chicago was one of the 2 or 3 key actors in state politics in general. And a lot of that changed over time. And Richard M. Daley was not as engaged with the legislature as past mayors have been. And now, clearly, you have to talk about the mayor of Chicago when you are thinking about the calculus, about the 4 leaders and the governor. There are lots of overlap in terms of Chicago's interests, so that's significant. I think there's no question about it. It is similar kinds of issues. There's a sense in which you let Chicago take care of its own problems, but on the other hand, it is the same set of issues in terms of what kinds of obligations do you have to people who have in good faith joined a pension system and essentially are now suffering from either the lies or the mismanagement of the people who were in power and in tough budget times. So I think it's significant that he came down and that you're engaging these issues. It also appears that he is more of the Madigan persuasion that one can force things without making concessions, which does not appear to be the Senate President's position. And so it'll be interesting to see how that works its way out in terms of whatever gets passed that goes to the courts litigate. I'm optimistically saying something gets passed. That roll call to pass that bill in the House on retiree could have been, it may not have been real. We had lots of downstate Republicans with state universities and state facilities and prisons voting against it. So now they can say, I didn't vote to cut your health care. And it would not be the first time that you had flurries of activity and everybody got on to say on the right side of the roll call and nothing happened. Now I think Chris is right. The situation is so bad they have to do something, but there certainly is a long tradition of flurries of activities and lots of roll calls with no substance actually appearing at the end of the session.
Well, and that makes an interesting point because a lot of folks are kind of speculating as to whether the session will go into extra, special session into the summer. It's scheduled to end at the end of this month, but there are a lot of things that have to get done, or at least that Governor Pat Quinn has said that he wants to see done. Chris, we were talking about this earlier. We've got just about a minute and a half left. Can you tell me a little bit about your thoughts on some of the things that really haven't even been scratched the surface yet?
Well, Medicaid reform is the big one. I mean, they've started scratching it. There's been some scratching going on, but I mean, it is really a much more complicated and a much more urgent issue than the pension problem. And there's a lot more people that are going to be affected by it. The costs are growing exponentially much quick and more immediately, whereas the big pension problem is the unfunded liability going down the road. We're talking about decades in some sense. But with Medicaid, we're talking about next month. We're talking about doctors that don't get paid for 9 months. We're talking about doctors that are stopping to take Medicaid patients, and so patients can't find doctors. And the cuts that the governor laid out in his sort of press conference, we haven't even seen a legislation out of it yet, but in the press conference it was fairly detailed and fairly significant, not crazy. It sounded like this was something that the governor and his people had actually thought about and worked through, and it started looking a lot more like an HMO in terms of the things that were not going to be covered and so forth. So there's some thought behind it, and I mean, this is not going to be something they're just, I guess I shouldn't say that. I mean, they could just cram it through overnight, but it seems unlikely because it's a tough thing. And in fact, I mean, I would wonder whether the Democrats who are in the majority even want to get it done by the end of the month. This is a painful thing, just like the pension system. Nobody's going to be happy with it. And so if they can push it off into June, they have to get the Republicans on board. Everybody buys in, and then it's harder to use it as a campaign issue.
Well, that's a bit of a bleak note, but we'll have to leave it at that. I'd like to thank my guests for coming today. Professor Redfield, Professor Mooney, thanks for joining us. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn, and we'll be back next week. But in the meantime, please check us out on our Facebook page. Capitol View Politics at Facebook. And join us next week on Capitol View.